Hello, everyone, and welcome to another wonderful episode of Paranormal Minds. I am your host, Shannon Ray, and I'd like to thank all you ladies and gentlemen for tuning in this week as we have special guest Ken Gerhard. And before I bring him in, I do want to take a moment just to kind of talk about him in a good way. And Ken is a professional monster hunter. He investigates reports of Bigfoot, the chupacabras, gigantic winged creatures, and other mysterious beasts. Ken's idea of a good time is stalking through the woods at night with his shotgun dressed in leather. As a cryptozoologist and a paranormal researcher, he has been featured on the History Channel series Monster Quest and also on A&E's Legend Hunter. His book, Big Bird, Modern Sightings of Flying Monsters, chronicles decades of encounters with a monstrous flying animal reported throughout South Texas. Gerhard has traveled around the world to many mysterious places, from Loch Ness to Stonehenge to the Amazon jungle and to the Galapagos Islands, Australia, Thailand, and Tanzania. In addition to cryptozoology, Ken is a lead singer for 3 bands and has produced several albums and toured extensively, performing hundreds of concerts throughout North America. Ken is definitely a very busy man, but I am very glad that he is here tonight with us. And with that being said, I would like to welcome in Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
Hi, Shannon. Thanks for having me on this evening.
I'm super excited to have you on, and I gotta touch base just a little bit on your introduction. Going through the woods, stalking through the woods with a shotgun. What kind of shotgun you using, Ken?
Well, it depends on what I'm looking for, but typically I carry a 12 gauge with slugs. And by the way, you must have got that bio or part of my bio off of MySpace, right? Which I admit I've updated a little bit since then. That all sounds good, but I don't know if I wear the leather too much anymore. If it's particularly if it's hot, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're trying to blend in and find Bigfoot, I'd imagine camo would be a little bit more effective with that as well.
Camo that I've seen, so
that might be a good investment opportunity right there, leather camo. Because I know how some men are about their leather, so hey, that might be an idea. I'd buy some stock in that.
Yeah, well, don't want to give your listeners the wrong impression, but I play in a kind of a crazy metal goth industrial band, so that's why I wear a lot of leather.
Well, that's
that
cool.
reason and that alone.
That is cool. There's nothing wrong with that. I know, especially
no, nothing wrong with that.
I know, especially where I'm from in Georgia, a lot of Southern men, they like their leather. So I mean, You're not alone. Hello.
Yeah.
Not by any far means, or by any skip, jump, or leap. So I do want to go ahead and start talking about you personally before we break into all your adventures and your books. What originally sparked your interest in the paranormal field, and why did you focus towards cryptozoology and monsters?
Well, I guess my interest in the unexplained dates back to when I was a young boy, and I remember when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I saw a TV show about Bigfoot. And this was kind of back in the late 70s, and it really piqued my interest. And at that point, I, went out and found every book I could on the subject at the library, and just filled my mind full of all these magical and mysterious notions. And I also read books, of course, about ghost hunting and UFOs and anything unexplained, the Bermuda Triangle. My mother was very adventurous, and she liked to tell me stories about the Mothman and the Yeti, and she certainly filled my mind full of all of these sort of whimsical things. So that's pretty much it. And then as I got older, I didn't really think about pursuing it as a career, but when I was 15 years old, I was at Loch Ness in Scotland, and it was at that point that I attempted my first field research. And then as I got older and older, things just kind of happened, and I became actively involved in looking for Bigfoot with other investigators and doing my own investigations and research. And so it's been kind of a lifelong passion of mine.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I like to reiterate and just, constantly point on with people. The people in this field, it's not a drive-by night kind of thing where you wake up one morning and you decide, hey, this is what I'm going to do. It's a lifelong passion and yearning, and, it's you don't feel fulfilled if you're not doing it.
Well, that's true. I'm sure you're right about that. And, some people may become late bloomers and get into it at a later stage. But
Yeah.
for many of us, and I know particularly for many of my friends and colleagues who are, for example, Bigfoot researchers, which is a big part of cryptozoology, a lot of them grew up in the same time frame that I did back in the 70s, early 80s, and there were a lot of, TV shows on at that time. You had In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy, and there was a movie called The Legend of Boggy Creek that was pretty big in the 70s. There was the $6 Million Man episode where he fought Bigfoot. And so there are all these, old shows about UFOs and things. And so that was kind of a really cool time to grow up in terms of the unexplained and a lot of the books, magazines, TV shows that were out there. And I think it probably influenced me at an early age, and it's just stuck with me my whole life.
Yeah, and I really wish I could, because I wasn't born until 86. And I really wish I could say, I had like all these, fundamental things that kind of inspired me, but it was really my personal experiences and a gut thing that inspired me. And I could go through and pinpoint things even in my childhood that inspired me and drove me towards it. But when I was like in high school and stuff, and when you didn't talk about this stuff. It was never cool to talk about, which totally blows my mind, because now it's like, it's cool, it's okay to talk about. And I'm happy for that. It's just, it's a totally different scenario than what we experience, nowadays.
Oh yeah, I'm sure you're right. And things in our culture and our society tend to go in cycles. So there have been points in the past where things were cool, not cool, cool again, and so forth. And of course, the world has changed dramatically with the amount of information that's accessible now through things like the internet and multimedia. But for example, when I was growing up in the late 70s, if you went to the bookstore and looked for a book on, ghost hunting and spiritual phenomenon, pretty much the only books you could find were by Ed and Lorraine Warren. There just weren't a lot of books out there. And so those were the ones that you bought. And then, nowadays, if you go to the metaphysical section at a bookstore, you'll see just, lots and lots of books. And, it's really kind of grown into a pretty huge industry, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of cool that there's so many options out there now.
Yeah, and I think it's honestly, like, especially like for like my son, and who's interested in it now, and he can tell his friends about it, and they don't look at him like he's crazy,
Mm-hmm.
And it just, to me, it's a prideful, like, happy, heartwarming moment where you don't have to like be looked at and scrutinized by talking about it anymore.
Well, that's true. I think people are more open-minded these days, and I guess a lot of it just has to do with the fact that our society is as I mentioned, it's a multimedia society. There's so much information out there that people can find and explore. And, if you follow the news or news feeds on the internet, there are constantly new things that are being discovered. And so I think it's kind of naive for humans to say that, we have everything figured out, that we know it all, that there aren't things out there that we don't understand.
Yeah, and it just, I like it because at the end of the day, whether it's cryptozoology or UFOlogy or just, regular looking for spirits, that kind of thing, it all falls under the paranormal field, but it all feeds into this proverbial yearning, I think, that every person, no matter your religion, has inside of you to want to know what happens after we die. Or why are strange things going on that we can't explain? It's that curiosity. It seems like we're just programmed and for people to be tapping into that, I think it's awesome.
I'm right with you.
So I want to start talking about first Big Bird, and I'm not talking about Big Bird on Sesame Street. I'm talking about Big Bird Modern Sightings of Flying Monsters, which is your book, one of them. And I want to ask you, can you take a moment just to kind of explain the contents of the book, kind of like a general synopsis?
Yeah, my first book is called Big Bird Modern Sightings of Flying Monsters. And as you alluded to, it's not about the Sesame Street character, although the name actually did come from the Sesame Street character. It was there was a newspaper reporter back in the 70s that kind of pulled that name out, and then that's kind of what stuck. But Big Bird is my first book. I started researching it, probably about a decade ago, if not earlier. And it is essentially about sightings and reports of giant winged creatures, specifically here in Texas, where there seem to be a lot of them in South Texas. And the descriptions vary a little bit, but essentially there are two basic types that people describe. One is a giant bird, black or dark feathers, very similar looking to a giant vulture or enormous eagle with a hooked, raptor type of beak. And what's really remarkable is that people have described these birds as having a wingspan anywhere from 15 to 25 feet across, which is much, much larger than any known bird species, larger than the largest eagles and so forth, condors and the like. And so that is actually a big bird when you consider that. I have also collected a number of reports from people who have described something different, also quite enormous, but typically what people describe as something that looks prehistoric. And oftentimes they have compared them to pterodactyls or pterosaurs, which of course are the giant flying reptiles that were contemporary with the dinosaurs millions of years ago. And those eyewitnesses claim that what they saw had basically no feathers, kind of a leathery hide-type covering, and oftentimes bat-like wings and teeth and, a head crest and a long sort of snake-like tail. So I guess Big Bird is a name that has been applied to both creatures, and it's definitely a mystery because, I'm not really sure if there are actually two different creatures that people are seeing, or if there's one creature that perhaps bears characteristics or affinities to the other. But it's definitely a great mystery.
Now, would you say some might say, okay, in the unexplored parts, of the world, maybe some type of creature might have not been identified yet, and it might be hard to identify it because of it, but not in the USA. How would a creature like this go for so long without being noticed and captured or documented, or even, have more supporting evidence within the United States? What do you say to a person that has those questions?
Well, that's a great point. And, I know it is hard for people to believe, but typically when I start talking about cryptozoology, I point to the fact that much of the world's land surface, including here in North America, is really vast wilderness area still. Based on a recent scientific survey, as much as 46%, or almost half of the world's land surface, remains wilderness area. Wilderness area being defined as uninhabited by man. And when you consider all of the vast mountain ranges and deserts and swamps and jungles and forests and tundras and areas like that humans tend not to live because they're not very hospitable areas to live in, it certainly bodes very well for the existence of some of these creatures. Now, even in North America, and I've had the great pleasure of traveling all over the United States and North America, people tend to live or populate in these kind of centralized urban areas, and to some extent in sprawling outward into suburban and rural areas. But in between some of those areas, there are these vast wilderness areas that humans don't go to often. And, that I think bodes very well for the existence of some of these unidentified creatures. For example, where I live at right now in San Antonio, Texas, if I were to start driving west from where I live on Highway I-10, there would be basically 600 miles of nothing before I get to El Paso, which is the next major city in Texas. Moreover, if you cross the border out of Texas and go into Mexico, you have the very vast Sierra Madre Mountains, which are some of the most unexplored mountain ranges in North America still. Literally areas where no human has ever set foot. And, that's just across the border from where I live, and not far from where many of these big bird sightings have come.
Now, in regards to the big bird, I'm just kind of focusing on the big bird for right now. In regards to the big bird, do you think that any type of alludement to, man-made towns and cities and them not being within those areas, do you think that serves to maybe represent that there's some kind of intelligence there to stay away from being found?
Well, there are a number of theories that would, hopefully try to or attempt to explain that. Many animals tend to be very elusive. Now, the intelligence of a large bird or a pterodactyl is, completely theoretical or speculative in terms of how smart. We would think that a giant bird is no smarter than any other giant bird, so they're basically going where their instinct tells them to. Same with pterosaurs. We don't know very much about how they actually lived and their behavior patterns because, all we know of them is from fossils, and we can only speculate about, that kind of stuff. But, I would think that it's more likely the case that animals instinctually will choose to live in areas that, are basically safe havens and remote areas where they have good food supplies, good water supplies. And so in the case of big bird, I tend to believe that these creatures live in some of these remote mountain ranges in Mexico, and that they're only seen on occasion when they fly out of their normal areas and normal habitats, and then are seen over flying areas where they've strayed out of their comfort zone, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But of course, there are also many other colorful theories out there that some of these creatures, cryptids is what we refer to them as in the field of cryptozoology, could actually be somehow supernatural in nature. That is, they could be interdimensional or, time travelers or something along those lines, apparitions, so really can't prove or disprove any of those theories. It's pretty much all up in the air.
Yeah, it's all speculation, but asking questions is how you get to finding answers. If you never ask questions, you never find answers.
Correct. And that's a completely scientific perspective, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you believe could possibly be the evolution of the big bird? Like, what did it evolve from? How, things of that nature?
Well, that's a good question. I think one of the things that's very promising in terms of big bird is that there were animals in our fossil history that looked exactly like what people are describing today. For example, in the case of, we mentioned the pterodactyls earlier, the largest known pterodactyl, in fact, that lived up to the very end of the Cretaceous period, about 65 million years ago, was known as Quetzalcoatlus. And its fossils have been found in West Texas in Big Bend National Park. And based on reconstructions, we believe that this enormous pterodactyl had a wingspan of about 40 feet across, probably the largest flying thing that ever lived on the planet. Mm-hmm. So we know that pterosaurs and pterodactyls did live in Texas up until 65 million years ago. Well, 65 million years is a big stretch, of course, to consider that something may have survived past that extinction date and then still remained elusive today. On the other hand, with regard to the other sightings where people have described these enormous black raptor-type birds, there are creatures in our fossil history known as teratorns. Teratorns were essentially the ancestors to modern condors, vultures, and birds like that. And they lived in North America up until about, maybe 10 or 11,000 years ago, maybe as recently as 8,000 years ago, based on fossil evidence. And many fossils of these teratorns have been found in California's La Brea tar pits, states like Nevada, Oregon, and so forth. So think about a bird that had a wingspan of about 18 feet across. Some of the teratorns got that big. That probably looked very similar to modern condors and vultures. And, that's essentially what people are describing today. So in geologic terms, it's not that hard to imagine that a creature could have survived, that a creature that we assumed went extinct about 10,000 years ago could still be alive in some remote areas.
Which isn't that far-fetched,
No, I don't think so.
whatsoever, especially if you start, looking at the wide, vast of untouched man land, so to speak, throughout the earth.
Yes, and there are examples of, for people that aren't familiar with, zoology and cryptozoology, new animal species are being discovered and rediscovered all the time. Now, an animal that was thought to be extinct and then is found alive is called a Lazarus taxon. And there's some very good examples of that, but one is that there was a fish known as the coelacanth that was only known from the fossil history, and it was believed to have gone extinct millions of years ago. And then in 1938, one of these coelacanth fish was cut off the coast of South Africa. So we know that that species is alive and well. There's another example known as the Ruachi horses, and these are basically small Ice Age horses that really bear little resemblance to modern horses, and a herd of these horses was found alive and well in the valley of Tibet probably about 15, 20 years ago. So there are examples of animals that were thought to be extinct that did turn up and are living and well.
So, excuse me, I had to clear my throat for a moment. I do want to kind of move into aspects of Big Bird, the book and the accounts that you have within the book. Where did the tales and the accounts that you gathered, where did they come from? I mean, I know you can't name your sources, so to speak, but just vague, were they with encounters? And maybe if you could tell us one that you really think is the most memorable, that would be really great.
Well, a lot of the information for the Big Bird book I gleaned from newspaper articles from the 1970s, because most of the sightings of Big Bird actually took place in the year 1976. And there were so many newspaper articles that came out all over South Texas and also went worldwide. So a lot of those cases I was able to basically reprint facts as stated in the articles. Now, in one case, I was able to track down a researcher who had been involved in the investigation back in 1976, and he was actually alive and well as of 2004. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago, but his name was Guadalupe Cantu, and he lived down in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. And I worked in conjunction with Guadalupe, and he was actually able to give me other reports of people in his neighborhood had other sightings that people had claimed to have had of these big birds in that area. I was also able to track down some other eyewitnesses as well. Not a bunch, but a few here and there. So it's kind of a mixture. But I would say probably one of my favorite accounts from that time period, which I think is pretty remarkable, is it involved three school teachers who worked and lived here in San Antonio. And one morning in February of 1976, they were driving to work, and they claimed that they saw these two enormous, what they later described as pterodactyls, flying over a cow pasture. And they actually pulled over their cars to the side of the road and got out of their cars, and they watched these things probably, somewhat hesitantly for a number of minutes. And then they got in their cars and drove on to the school where they worked. And throughout the course of that day, they actually looked through different encyclopedias and science books, and they came to a determination that, without a doubt, what they had seen was a pterodactyl. There was no doubt about it. So that particular account came out in the local newspapers here in San Antonio. It made pretty big news. And, in fact, the school superintendent and school board told the teachers to stop talking about it publicly because they were worried about creating a panic among the students and so forth. So that's just one of many, many accounts. Again, many very good ones from the night. There were two gentlemen, I'll give you one or two more. There were two gentlemen down in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, one in Brownsville, a gentleman named Alberto Guajardo, who claims that this big bird slammed into the side of his trailer home one night, and he actually went outside and confronted it, and they just kind of stared each other down, and then the thing kind of vanished into the darkness. And about a week later, there was a gentleman named Armando Grimaldo up in Raymondville, Texas, not far from there, who claimed he was sitting out on his patio one night and this thing actually came down from the sky and attacked him and clawed at him and tore his clothing. And he was subsequently he was rushed to the local Willacy County Hospital there in a state of shock. So
wow.
Those are some famous accounts that people who are into cryptozoology or into the unexplained may have heard of some of those cases before.
Last question before we move on from Big Bird. Is there any type of DNA or scientific evidence that has been collected at all, even since the 70s to now, that might support the, scientifically prove the existence of this bird?
Unfortunately, there is no physical evidence, and I think that's one of the really frustrating things within the field of cryptozoology is much of cryptozoology is based on anecdotal evidence, that is, eyewitness reports and descriptions, legends and mythologies, and occasionally we get some ambiguous photographic evidence, whether it's a snapshot or a short video clip or whatever. But in terms of the big birds, I'm not aware of any physical evidence. No one has come up with a giant feather, a giant egg, a giant pile of bird droppings on their car.
Yeah, I mean, that's just the one thing, with me that, as far as cryptozoology goes, these animals leave imprints. And, I mean, if it was me, I'd be like looking for Bigfoot poo-poo or the big bird poo-poo, because that contains DNA. And if you could have that DNA and prove that this species is not yet identified, and they have to do it. Everybody does it.
Absolutely, and that is very frustrating. And the big birds probably have, unfortunately, less evidence than most of the creatures that we look for in cryptozoology. Bigfoot, for example, has some physical evidence. They have found hair samples, droppings, and there is alleged DNA evidence out there that has been scrutinized, but is very controversial at this point. Mm-hmm. There have also been some near misses in terms of bodies that have turned up. For example, as far as the big birds go, there's a famous case that happened at the end of the 19th century where a giant pterodactyl-looking thing was apparently shot or allegedly shot by two ranchers out in southern Arizona near Tucson. And according to some newspaper accounts of the time, the creature was actually nailed up to the side of a barn, and they took a picture of it. But unfortunately, that particular photograph is as elusive as the big bird itself. No one has been able to track down an original copy of it. So it's just kind of another one of those frustrating near misses.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to take a question. We have a chat box, Ken. I don't know if you know that or not.
No, I didn't.
Yeah, we have a chat box where viewers can kind of type in and ask questions. So I do have a question from the chat box, and it says, can you ask Ken about his feelings on the new findings in Tibet concerning a new bear species, I believe, and how it could relate to the Yeti myth?
Well, that's a great question. Yeah, there was a recent finding, DNA evidence from the Himalayas that was tested by a researcher, a scientist in England. And what he found is that the DNA that was claimed to be from a Yeti actually very closely matched a bear, and it's specifically a polar bear, which is quite unusual. Now, while that is very exciting news for a number of reasons, I think, because it also shows that there could be an unknown species of bear lurking around in the Himalayas, and that could also bode well for the existence of the Yeti, there is one clarification that has to be made, and that is that the word Yeti, or the name Yeti, has been used to describe different types of things over the years. And going as far back as the 1950s, there are at least 3 different types of Yetis that have been described by researchers and cryptozoologists. Mm-hmm. There's the standard Yeti that we think of, which is very similar to Bigfoot in description, kind of an ape-like creature walking on its hind legs, that is known as the Mette, which is basically the man-thing. There is a small type of Yeti that's been described from some of the valleys. It's called the Tet-Ima, and that particular creature is described as being kind of a little pygmy-sized creature that looks like a primate and eats frogs. And then there's a third type that's known as the Zutta. And while I don't pretend to speak Nepalese or Tibetan. Dukat has been loosely translated as meaning big, hulking thing, or some people have interpreted it as meaning man-bear. So there has been a long-held belief for years and years throughout cryptozoology that some of the Yeti reports could in fact refer to a giant species of bear, unknown species of bear lurking around in the Himalayas. So while I find the discovery of the DNA very exciting for a number of reasons, I don't think people should be under the impression that it solves the Yeti mystery once and for all, because there are definitely different things that have been described by eyewitnesses in those areas for years and years.
Yeah, and I believe that's a true, in that opinion of yours is truly, from a scientific, and you know what I'm saying? It's a very good opinion, not to just focus in on one thing. It takes a lot.
Exactly, and sometimes, names, what's in a name, right? As Shakespeare said, names can often be used as sort of blanket terms to describe a lot of different things. And I think that's what's happened with the name Yeti, is it's basically we're talking about several different animals.
Yeah, absolutely. One more question from the chat box, then we're going to move into your book, Encounters with Flying Humanoids. This one says, I encountered a black-headed dog, half human, that shapeshifted in front of my eyes in 2009. Recently, people associated this with the Nefer, I hope I'm saying that right, of UFOlogy. Are you familiar with this phenomenon?
No, I'm not. What was the last name again? Can you say that again? The what?
The name people have associated that with is Nefer, N-E-F-E-R. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but N-E-F-E-R.
No, I'm not familiar with that specific term, but what the description is a humanoid with the head of a black dog?
Yeah, it's like a black-headed dog, half human, that basically shapeshifted in front of their eyes in 2009.
Well, that's a very remarkable account. What I can say is that you have creatures that have been described as modern werewolves. One of my colleagues, Linda Godfrey, who's written a number of excellent books on the modern werewolf phenomenon, in Wisconsin it's known as the Beast of Bray Road. In Michigan it's referred to as the Michigan Dog Man. And what people have described is essentially very similar to the classic Hollywood werewolf. That is a bipedal creature that walks, bipedal meaning walking on its hind legs, with the head of a dog or a wolf and kind of a stooped posture. And, this is kind of a comprehensive topic, so I don't know how much we want to get into it. But if you look back at mythology, you have things obviously like Anubis. In Egyptian mythology, there's Anubis, the dog-headed man. And so there are sort of folkloric references to creatures like that dating back, thousands of years. And there are modern eyewitness accounts as well. But I'm not familiar with, and the shape-shifting, of course, is something that I'm familiar with in terms of Native American legends of skinwalkers and things like that. Mm-hmm. But I'm not really familiar with that particular name or with any alleged links to UFOs. Okay.
Sounds awesome to me. Hopefully that clarified for you. If not, let me know. And she said yes, yes, Anubis, and like a werewolf. That's how I saw it. And
I would suggest that whoever wrote that in, if they haven't done so already, that they get in touch with Linda Godfrey in Wisconsin, because she could provide a lot more information than I could on that particular situation. But thanks for sharing that. That's super cool.
Yeah, I think it's really awesome too. All right, so let's move into Encounters with Flying Humanoids, Mothman, Man-Birds, Gargoyles, and Other Winged Beasts. So this is your newest book, correct, Ken? I believe it is, but I want to just clarify.
Yeah, it just came out in September.
And how you've had some pretty good reviews on this too, from what my research turned up.
Well, I've been very happy. Everyone that's read it has told me that they've really enjoyed it, and getting a lot of good feedback on it. Of all the really weird things that I've investigated in my life, this is probably one of the weirdest, without a doubt.
All right, so let's can you take just like a brief moment, because I do have a breakdown of other specific questions I want to ask you about creatures within the book. So if you could just take a brief moment just to give like a brief synopsis of the book for our viewers, for those of them that have not read it.
Well, I'm sure that many of your listeners are familiar with the Mothman. Mothman is a creature that has been reported from the town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, which lies in the border of Oklahoma. It's kind of a small little town there on the border on the Ohio River. Mothman was made famous by a book called The Mothman Prophecies, which was later made into a movie with Richard Gere. And the Mothman is described as basically a man-like or humanoid creature standing about 6.5 feet tall with enormous wings. And perhaps the most startling feature are these giant red hypnotic eyes that people have described. And Mothman was sighted many, many times over the course of the year 1966, 1967. There were many people who encountered Mothman that claimed that they were later visited by mysterious men in black who told them to stop talking about it. There were a number of UFO sightings in the area at that time. And probably the most tragic thing is that there was a bridge collapse. The Silver Bridge, which was a suspension bridge over the Ohio River, collapsed right before Christmas in 1967, exactly 1 year and 1 day after Mothman was first sighted. And 46 people sadly lost their lives and drowned in the river, in the icy waters of the Ohio River. So many people linked the Mothman's appearance to this tragic bridge collapse and to a lot of other weird things as well. And there are all these other layers to the mystery, conspiracies, curses, you name it. So it's a pretty weird and kind of creepy subject. But for my book, what I wanted to do is basically put together a compendium of different flying humanoid accounts from all over the world, because other than Mothman, there are some other interesting cases, and so I wanted to put all of those into one book. And so essentially that's what it's about. It's about the Mothman. It's about a creature from England known as the Owlman. I talk about the Jersey Devil, sightings of gargoyles and man-birds and all types of things.
Do you believe that the goal of flying humanoids, maybe I'm just making too much of a generalization here just by saying flying humanoids in general, but we'll roll with it. Do you believe that the goal of these flying humanoids are to feed off your deepest fears?
I believe that is something that I talk about in the book, and the reason I bring that up is because many people that have encountered these beings, whatever they are, have, of course, been utterly terrified by them, but there are many accounts of these beings or apparitions, manifestations, whatever you want to call them, actually chasing people. No one's really claimed to have been attacked by one, but many people have claimed, for example, that Mothman chased them in their cars while they were driving at 100 miles an hour. Many people have claimed to have, broken down and had emotional issues and post-traumatic stress disorders and flashbacks. And so, encounters with these beings seems to really have an emotional impact on people. But the fact that they seem to want to chase people or terrify people, to me, is significant in terms of, perhaps they are somehow feeding off of our deepest fears.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, in case you haven't picked up my theme on this one, I'm all into like the whole evolution and biology of these types of creatures. So this question's coming from that aspect. Biologically speaking, how would the theory of the evolution of these flying humanoids, where would that even come from?
Well, it absolutely would not apply whatsoever. In fact, I mentioned in the book that there's no way that I think that these things could be flesh and blood. I mean, there's absolutely no way that these things evolved. There are no intermediate forms in our fossil history. There's absolutely no reason that a humanoid or a human would ever evolve, with wings. Mm-hmm. And so that is one of the really weird aspects of the case. So I really haven't come to a lot of conclusions about the flying humanoids, despite having researched it extensively for years and years. But the one thing I can say is that they are not flesh and blood creatures as we know. They're not anything that evolved naturally on this planet. So, I mean, I guess that kind of opens the door to all kinds of other theories. Some people say that they are demonic or interdimensional or extraterrestrial or who knows. But they're definitely supernatural in nature. They're not flesh and blood. They did not evolve, and they were not born in a way that we know.
Well, I have to say, and this is kind of like a side commentary for a moment. And for everybody, just so you know what I'm talking about, the image of the book cover is on your screen right now, next to Ken's face. But Ken, when I saw your book cover, it kind of reminded me of old dude from Jeepers Creepers. I'm telling you, it was one of those kind of experiences where I'm like, do I really want to read this? Because after I watched Jeepers Creepers, I couldn't sleep well for about a week.
Oh, I hear you. Well, it was actually my publisher that came up with the artwork, and I think they did a brilliant job with it. But there are many cases in the book where there are similar scenarios where people were essentially driving on dark and lonely roads at night, and they suddenly saw this thing standing by the side of the road or caught a glimpse of it in their headlights, and then, the chase was on. Oftentimes people claim that these things chased their cars or flew over their cars, took off, whatever. So I guess that particular image is kind of the embodiment of those reports.
So what is the Van Meter creature?
The Van Meter creature, also known as the Van Meter visitor, is a flying humanoid, I guess kind of a gargoyle, a two-legged gargoyle-type creature, massive creature, that was reported in the town of Van Meter, Iowa, according to newspaper reports that came out at the beginning of the 20th century. And it was seen really over the course of one night and the following day. There are allegations that local townspeople shot at the thing, that it basically disappeared down an old abandoned mine shaft. And really weird description, basically a two-legged creature standing, I think, about 9 feet tall, and some people described it as kind of having a glowing horn or single glowing eye in the middle of its forehead, and apparently it left behind a really rancid sulfur smell wherever it went. So, it's kind of a colorful story, and in fact, there's an entire book dedicated to the Van Meter visitor written by another gentleman, but we must not forget, even though I include a lot of these accounts in the book, I think it's important to point out that, a lot of these newspaper stories that came out, at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, were probably very, or at least to some extent fictionalized. We must not forget that, at that time period, a lot of times newspapers were in the business of selling newspapers. And so they would often print these kind of fabulous tales. So I don't know. There might be more to it than that. But that's essentially what the Van Meter visitor is.
So the Houston Batman. What's the deal with the Houston Batman? And I'm assuming from the Houston reference, we are discussing Houston, Texas, correct?
Correct. And it's unfortunately, we're not talking about the Caped Crusader here. So if you have any comic book fans out there, unfortunately, it's something completely different. But the Houston Batman is one of my favorite cases. It's pretty creepy and weird. There's only one sighting that I'm aware of, and that took place on June 18th, 1953. In a neighborhood of Houston, Texas. And at the time, there were 3 adults that were sitting outside late at night talking, and suddenly they saw this shadowy form fly across the lawn and land up on the branch of a large pecan tree. And as their eyes adjusted to the light, they could make out the form of a man-like figure standing about 6 to 7 feet tall, with bat-like wings attached. And what's really weird is that the figures appeared to be dressed in some type of uniform, what they described as a black paratrooper type of uniform, complete with a helmet and knee-length boots. And another really weird thing is that the Batman, as they called it, seemed to be emitting a dull, glowing light. And they watched this figure rock back and forth menacingly on the branch of the pecan tree for a few minutes, and then slowly the light began to fade out, and then the Batman vanished into thin air. And just a few moments later, there was a flash of light, and a torpedo-shaped object supposedly shot up into the sky. Well, one of the people that was present there, a woman named Hilda Walker, thought that it was important enough to go and report the encounter to the local police, and subsequently the Houston Batman made the Houston Chronicle newspaper. So it's a kind of a very famous case in 40 and lore. John Keel, the Mothman author, wrote about it, and it's kind of a really cool case. So a lot of people, of course, link it with UFOs because of the object that shot up into the sky, but who knows?
Yeah, that's always a good thing. Who knows? Because if we all knew, none of us would be doing what we're doing. So let's kind of shift gears in our last 10 minutes here and talk about what is the next monster you plan on tracking down and researching?
Well, that's a great question. I'm in a very fortunate position of receiving reports from people all over the country and all over the world all the time. Unfortunately, I'm not at liberty or don't have the resources and financial backing to just hop around the globe and investigate all of them. But typically, if I receive a compelling account or report from an eyewitness, I will call them up. I'll interview them maybe once, maybe twice, maybe a few times. And if I think that they're credible and there's something that intrigues me, I'll try to follow up on it. So right now I'm kind of laying low for the holidays like a lot of people, but early next year I plan on doing some investigations. There have been some sightings from South Texas of something that's described as a quote, unquote, living dinosaur, kind of a giant bipedal reptile, very similar to the velociraptors from Jurassic Park running around. There are reports of humanoid Bigfoot-type creatures from the swamps of Louisiana up to Florida. I've received reports of mysterious black panthers, which are basically giant black cats that people have described and reported slinking around in the woods. So I mean, I've got a pretty full docket, all kinds of things that I'm interested in, and that I plan on investigating in the coming year, and hopefully we'll get another book out of it.
Yeah, absolutely, and not just another book. I want you to have a good adventure.
Oh, always.
I'm always into like the adventures and stuff, you know. I do want to kind of top off with flying humanoids. Do you think there's any connection between flying humanoids and UFOs, tragedies, and curses?
I mean, there certainly is a perceived connection between some of those things. But I have to say, as a cryptozoologist, and I guess I kind of strayed away from my my chosen field a little bit with the Encounters with Flying Humanoids book, because it doesn't really tackle traditional cryptozoology, which is based on real scientific methodology and physical evidence. So, I have to say there is obviously no physical evidence for anything like Mothman existing. There's only eyewitness accounts. But what really fascinates me is the human factor. And the one common denominator in all of these different cases is that, well, it's basically us. It's the fact that there was a person or persons who claim to have had these remarkable experiences and who were affected in a very profound way. Mm-hmm. Now, in many of the cases I investigated, there were perceived connections to UFOs, for example. I think there could be something there. As far as curses, I think a lot of that is perhaps goes back to human perception and the fact that we like to create, even when we don't know or are comfortable with a particular subject matter, oftentimes we will create a theory or something that can help us kind of cope with or understand things a little bit better. And, it's certainly, we are spiritual beings, as you know. There's a lot of spirituality. In fact, you referenced that earlier quite eloquently when you talked about how we like to think about an afterlife and that there's more, than just a physical embodiment or existence. So, I think a lot of that, in terms of, curses and things like that, probably, goes back to our spirituality and the fact that we think that perhaps that things can essentially be born or created or manifested by us or by forces that are, you know, beyond us. So it's pretty cosmic stuff, I admit. And again, a little bit out of my comfort level as well, you know, from what I typically do, which is go out and look for poop. As you said earlier. Look for poop and hair and tracks, and that's what I'm comfortable with. But
well, that's always, honestly, this is always my thought about Bigfoot and everything. It's like, if I was out there, I'd just be looking for his poop, you know, because poop would have your answers, every answer you need in it, like right there, you know. I know that sounds silly, but that's just my thought process.
No, you're actually, it's a very poignant point. In fact, I can tell you, I had a couple that contacted me about a year and a half ago, and they claimed that they had irrefutable photographic evidence of Bigfoot on their property. Well, they didn't want to show it to me right away, and I kind of had to jump through some hoops, this and that. And then ultimately, they sent me some blurry photographs that didn't prove anything, and so I asked for more. And they basically were claiming that they had 50 Bigfoot creatures living on their property. Well, I told them, I said, well, if you have 50 Bigfoot creatures living on your property, then you have Bigfoot poop, Bigfoot droppings all over your property. So why don't you just scoop some of those droppings up into a baggie and send that to me instead?
Yeah.
And needless to say, I never did receive any of that. But you make a great point there.
You know, honestly, like, I wish that's something, because, you know, I have a paranormal team, and we basically just work with spirits and ghosts and trying to scientifically document that kind of thing. I wish I could just tell a client, hey, scoop up some ghost poop and mail it to me, and I'll get back to you, and we'll figure this thing out. You know, it just doesn't work that way. I actually have to go out there and spend money traveling and doing all the things we have to do.
Well, that's fascinating to me, and I have to tell you, because I have a lot of friends who are paranormal investigators and ghost hunters and psychics, that I find that utterly fascinating, that you folks will go out and try to prove something that, you know, conceivably there is no physical evidence for. I mean, I've heard the EVPs, I've seen photographs and this and that, but none of that really holds up to the rigid scientific standards. So, I really have a lot of respect and admiration for folks like you to go out and try to gather up that type of evidence.
And, you know, Ken, this goes back to the calling, you know, of why we do what we do. You know, you're in cryptozoology and I took a different path. But at the same time, for me, it was to help people. Because, you know, it's like I tell everybody when they look at me with that skeptic smile, I'm like, yeah, right. You know, like that you're kind of crazy smile. And this is my exact words to them. You might think I'm crazy now, but when it happens to you and you need my help, you're going to call me, you know? And that's the key thing to keep in mind is, you know, it's, to me, this, you know, as far as investigating, that's what it all boils down to, is being able to help people, because that's what I serve to do.
Well, I think you're absolutely right there, and I would like to point out to people that are a little bit closed-minded and skeptical. While I understand that perspective, I think that's a very dangerous point of view, because if you look back in history, there are so many times when humans have been proven wrong. You know, hundreds of years ago, everyone thought the world was flat. You know, people thought we would never get to the moon. People thought the Titanic would never sink. So there are just too many cases to count throughout history where humans have been proven wrong, and that will continue to happen as we go forward.
And I'm completely okay with humans being proved wrong, because I'm always the one asking the questions about crazy kinds of things like poop and other things.
Absolutely. Good questions.
I'm always that person. Well, Ken, I did want to take a moment just to thank you so much for being on tonight. And when you find that next monster and you are ready to do a book about it, I would be so honored to have you back on, because you have been an amazing, intelligent, and informative guest that has just been great.
Well, thank you, Shannon. I appreciate you having me on, and I would love to come back sometime and talk with you some more. And, you know, any of your listeners out there who are interested in any aspect of the unexplained, I would encourage you to go out and find a copy of my book, Encounters with Flying Humanoids, because it does cover all aspects of the unexplained, from UFOs to the supernatural to cryptozoology, everything.
And And those books, are those books available like on Amazon?
They're available on Amazon, barnesandnoble.com, and you can actually find them at most Barnes & Noble locations as well.
And I've been showing these books covers throughout the night, but and I know we did not have time to touch on the Monsters of Texas, but I do want to go ahead and just mention it. Ken's books are The Monsters of Texas, Big Bird, Modern Sightings of Flying Monsters, and his most recent release, Encounters with Flying Humanoids. And they are all great reads, great books, and it is something that, you know, I truly believe anybody that is not even, you don't even have to be interested in crypto. It's just something that I think that anybody could appreciate.
Well, thanks again, Shannon. I do appreciate your time, and I appreciate everyone that listened in tonight.
All right. Thank you so much, Ken. And before we go out, I do want to mention that next week we will be right back here, same time, same place, with author Laura Ventura. And we will be talking with her about mermaids, banshees, werewolves, and vampires. So be sure to tune in back here next week, same time, same place. Have a great week, everybody. Stay warm, stay safe. And if you're buried in snow, just don't go out. Stay in. Have a good weekend every week, everybody. Bye. I'm happy for that. It's just, it's a totally different scenario than what we experience, you know, nowadays.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure you're right. And, you know, things in our culture and our society tend to go in cycles. So there have been points in the past where things were cool, not cool, cool again, and so forth. And, of course, the world has changed dramatically with the amount of information that's accessible now through things like the internet and multimedia. But, for example, you know, when I was growing up in the late 70s, if you went to the bookstore and looked for a book on, you know, ghost hunting and spiritual phenomenon, pretty much the only books you could find were by Ed and Lorraine Warren. There just weren't a lot of books out there. And so those were the ones that you bought. And then, you know, nowadays, if you go to the metaphysical section at a, you know, the bookstore, you'll see just, you know, lots and lots of books. And, you know, it's really kind of grown into a pretty huge industry, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of cool that there's so many options out there now.
Yeah, and I think it's honestly, like, especially like for like my son, and you know, who's interested in it now, and he can tell his friends about it, and they don't look at him like he's crazy, you know. Mm-hmm. And it just, to me, it's a prideful, like, happy, heartwarming moment where you don't have to like be looked at and scrutinized by talking about it anymore.
Well, that's true. I think people are more open-minded these days, and I guess a lot of it just has to do with you know, the fact that our society is you know, as I mentioned, it's a multimedia society. There's so much information out there that people can find and explore, and you know, if you follow the news.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another wonderful episode of Paranormal Minds. I am your host, Shannon Ray, and I'd like to thank all you ladies and gentlemen for tuning in this week as we have special guest Ken Gerhard. And before I bring him in, I do want to take a moment just to kind of talk about him in a good way. And Ken is a professional monster hunter. He investigates reports of Bigfoot, the chupacabras, gigantic winged creatures, and other mysterious beasts. Ken's idea of a good time is stalking through the woods at night with his shotgun dressed in leather. As a cryptozoologist and a paranormal researcher, he has been featured on the History Channel series Monster Quest and also on A&E's Legend Hunter. His book, Big Bird, Modern Sightings of Flying Monsters, chronicles decades of encounters with a monstrous flying animal reported throughout South Texas. Gerhard has traveled around the world to many mysterious places, from Loch Ness to Stonehenge to the Amazon jungle and to the Galapagos Islands, Australia, Thailand, and Tanzania. In addition to cryptozoology, Ken is a lead singer for 3 bands and has produced several albums and toured extensively, performing hundreds of concerts throughout North America. Ken is definitely a very busy man, but I am very glad that he is here tonight with us. And with that being said, I would like to welcome in Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
Hi, Shannon. Thanks for having me on this evening.
I'm super excited. Originally sparked your interest in the paranormal field. And why did you focus towards cryptozoology and monsters?
Well, I guess my interest in the unexplained dates back to when I was a young boy. And, you know, I remember when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I saw a TV show about Bigfoot. and this was kind of back in the late 70s, and it really piqued my interest. And at that point, I, went out and found every book I could on the subject at the library, and just filled my mind full of all these magical and mysterious notions. And I also read books, of course, about ghost hunting and UFOs and anything unexplained, the Bermuda Triangle. My mother was she was very adventurous, and she liked to tell me stories about the Mothman and the Yeti, and she certainly filled my mind full of all of these sort of whimsical things. So that's pretty much it. And then as I got older, I didn't really think about pursuing it as a career, but when I was 15 years old, I was at Loch Ness in Scotland, and it was at that point that I attempted my first field research. And then as I got older and older, things just kind of happened, and I became actively involved in looking for Bigfoot with other investigators, and doing my own investigations and research. And so it's been kind of a lifelong passion of mine.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I like to reiterate and just, constantly point on with people. The people in this field, it's not a drive-by-night kind of thing where you wake up one morning to have you on. And I got to touch base just a little bit on, your introduction. Going through the woods, stalking through the woods with a shotgun. What kind of shotgun you using, Ken?
Well, it depends on what I'm looking for. But typically I carry a 12 gauge with slugs. And by the way, you must have got that bio or part of my bio off of MySpace, right? Which I admit I've updated a little bit since then. That all sounds good, but I don't know if I wear the leather too much anymore. If it's particularly if it's hot,
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're trying to blend in and find Bigfoot, I'd imagine camo would be a little bit more effective with that as well.
Camo that I've seen, so
that might be a good investment opportunity right there, leather camo. Because I know how some men are about their leather. So hey, that might be an idea. I'd buy some stock in that.
Yeah, well, don't want to give your listeners the wrong impression, but I play in a kind of a crazy metal goth industrial band, so that's why I wear a lot of leather.
Well, that's
that
cool.
reason and that alone.
That is cool. There's nothing wrong with that. I know, especially
no, nothing wrong with that.
I know, especially where I'm from in Georgia, a lot of Southern men, they like their leather. So you're not alone. Hello.
Yeah.
Not by any far means, or by any skip, jump, or leap. So I do want to go ahead and start talking about you personally before we break into all your adventures and your books. And you decide, hey, this is what I'm going to do. It's a lifelong passion and yearning, and it's you don't feel fulfilled if you're not doing it.
Well, that's true. I'm sure you're right about that. And some people may become late bloomers and get into it at a later stage, but. Yeah. For many of us, and I know particularly for many of my friends and colleagues who are, for example, Bigfoot researchers, which is a big part of cryptozoology, a lot of them grew up in the same time frame that I did back in the 70s, early 80s, and there were a lot of TV shows on at that time. You had In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy, and there was a movie called The Legend of Boggy Creek that was pretty big in the 70s. There was the $6 Million Man episode where he fought Bigfoot, and so there are all these old shows about UFOs and things, and so that was kind of a really cool time to grow up in terms of the unexplained and a lot of the books, magazines, TV shows that were out there, and I think it probably influenced me at an early age, and it's just stuck with me my whole life.
Yeah, and I really wish I could, because I wasn't born until 86, and I really wish I could say, I had all these, fundamental things that kind of inspired me, but it was really my personal experiences and a gut thing that inspired me, and I could go through and pinpoint things even in my childhood that inspired me and drove me towards it. But when I was in high school and stuff, and when you didn't talk about this stuff. It was never cool to talk about, which totally blows my mind, because now it's it's cool, it's okay to talk about. And I'm